Peggy's trembling hands gripped the letter, her heart pounding as she recognized Frank's handwriting after 50 years of silence. The words on the page would destroy everything he thought he knew about the life he had chosen. The gentle rustle of paper echoed through Frank Thompson's study as he held the yellowed envelope with trembling hands. At 78, his fingers weren't as steady as they once were, but the weight of the letter seemed to amplify every tremor. The musty scent of aged paper mingled with the faint aroma of his morning coffee, creating an olfactory time capsule that transported him back half a century. Frank's eyes, still sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses, scanned the carefully penned address. His heart raced, a staccato rhythm that belied his outward calm. He took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp Connecticut air that wafted through the open window. The distant chirping of birds and the soft whisper of leaves in the breeze provided a soothing counterpoint to the tumult of his emotions. As he carefully unsealed the envelope, memories flooded back. Memories of a time when his hair was thick and dark, his ambitions boundless, and his heart full of youthful passion. The letter inside, written in a flowing script he hadn't seen in decades, seemed to pulse with life in his hands. "Dear Frank," it began, and those two simple words were enough to make his breath catch in his throat. He leaned back in his leather armchair, the material creaking softly as it adjusted to his weight. The study around him, once a testament to his professional success, now felt like a mausoleum of missed opportunities. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with tomes on business strategy and economic theory, silent witnesses to the choices that had shaped his life. As Frank's eyes devoured the words on the page, the world around him faded away. He was no longer an aging widower in a quiet New England town, but a young man standing at a crossroads, the future stretching out before him like an uncharted map. The letter was from Margaret Peggy Sullivan, the woman he had loved and left behind in pursuit of his career. Her words, infused with a mix of long-held hurt and tentative hope, pierced through the carefully constructed walls of his heart. "I never thought I'd hear from you again," Peggy wrote. "After all these years, I'd convinced myself that our time together was nothing more than a beautiful dream. But your letter, it's awakened something in me that I thought was long dead." Frank's hand shook more violently, causing the paper to rustle loudly in the quiet room. He set the letter down on his mahogany desk, running a hand through his thinning silver hair as he tried to process the emotions coursing through him. A soft knock at the study door jolted him back to the present. "Grandpa?" called a familiar voice. "Are you in there?" "Come in, Emily," Frank responded, quickly folding the letter and slipping it into his desk drawer. The door opened, revealing his granddaughter, Emily Thompson. At 25, she was the spitting image of her grandmother, Frank's late wife, with the same warm brown eyes and infectious smile. She carried a tray with a fresh pot of coffee and 2 mugs. "I thought you might need a refill," Emily said, setting the tray down on a side table. Her eyes, keen and observant like the journalist she was, scanned her grandfather's face. "Is everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank managed a small smile. "Not a ghost, exactly. More like a memory come to life." Emily raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. She poured coffee for both of them, the rich aroma filling the room. "That sounds intriguing. Care to share?" For a moment, Frank hesitated. He had never spoken to anyone about Peggy, not even his late wife. It was a chapter of his life he had kept tightly sealed, like a time capsule buried deep in the recesses of his mind. But as he looked at Emily, with her open, caring expression, he felt a sudden urge to unburden himself. "It's a long story," he began, accepting the mug of coffee from Emily. "One that starts long before you were born, even before your mother was born." Emily settled into the chair across from him, her eyes alight. "I've got time, Grandpa, and you know how much I love a good story." Frank took a sip of his coffee, letting the warm liquid fortify him. Then, with a deep breath, he began to speak. "It was the summer of 1965, he said, his voice taking on a distant quality as he transported himself back in time. "I was young, ambitious, and thought I had the whole world figured out. And then I met a girl named Peggy Sullivan." As Frank spoke, the study around them seemed to fade away, replaced by the vibrant colors and sounds of a world long past. He told Emily about the whirlwind romance, the stolen kisses under starlit skies, and the dreams they had shared. But most of all, he spoke of the choice he had made, the fateful decision to pursue his career over love. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Frank said, his voice heavy with regret. "I convinced myself that success and financial security were more important than what we had." Emily listened intently, her coffee forgotten as she absorbed every word. "And now?" she prompted gently. "What's changed?" Frank reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the letter, holding it like a precious artifact. "Peggy wrote back," he said simply. "After all these years, she wrote back." Emily's eyes widened. Wow, Grandpa, that's incredible. What did she say?" "She's never married," Frank replied, his voice barely above a whisper. She says she's never stopped thinking about me, about us." A moment of silence fell between them as the weight of this revelation settled in the room. Emily leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on her grandfather's arm. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. Frank looked up, meeting his granddaughter's gaze. In her eyes, he saw not judgment, but understanding and support. It gave him the courage to voice the thought that had been forming in his mind since he first read Peggy's letter. "I think," he said slowly, "I think I need to see her, to talk to her face to face, to see if there's still a chance for us." Emily nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I think that's a great idea, Grandpa. And if you need any help—" "Actually," Frank interjected, feeling a spark of his old decisiveness, "I could use your help. Peggy's living in a different state now, and I'm not as good with all this internet stuff as you are. Do you think you could help me find her exact address?" Emily's smile widened. "Of course, Grandpa. We'll find her together." As they began to plan, Frank felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was hope, he realized. Hope for a second chance. Hope for a future he had long thought impossible. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the study. It felt like a sign, Frank thought. A new day dawning, full of possibilities. For the first time in years, Frank Thompson looked forward to tomorrow. As the afternoon light softened, Frank and Emily sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of papers and Emily's laptop. The gentle hum of the computer and the occasional clink of coffee mugs against the wooden surface filled the comfortable silence between them. Emily's fingers flew over the keyboard, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay, Grandpa," she said, looking up from the screen. "I think I've found her. Margaret Sullivan, living in Asheville, North Carolina." Frank's heart skipped a beat. "Asheville? That's where we always talked about retiring. We loved the mountains." His voice trailed off, lost in memories of conversations long past. Emily reached out and squeezed his hand. "It seems like she held on to that dream for both of you," she said softly. Frank nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He stood up abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the backyard. The familiar landscape of suburban Connecticut suddenly felt confining, a reminder of the life he had chosen over the one he had dreamed of with Peggy. "Tell me more about her, Grandpa," Emily prompted gently. "What was she like back then?" Frank turned back to his granddaughter, a wistful smile playing on his lips. "Peggy was like a force of nature, brilliant, passionate, always full of ideas. She wanted to be a teacher, to shape young minds and make a difference in the world." As he spoke, the memories came flooding back, as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. He told Emily about Peggy's infectious laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams, and how she could argue circles around anyone foolish enough to underestimate. "She challenged me," Frank said, his voice filled with admiration. "Made me question everything I thought I knew about the world and myself. With her, I felt like I could be more than just another guy in a suit chasing the American dream." Emily listened intently, her journalist's instincts picking up on the depths of emotion in her grandfather's voice. "She sounds amazing," she said. "No wonder you never forgot her." Frank nodded, returning to his seat at the table. "I tried to, forget her. I threw myself into my work, climbed the corporate ladder, married your grandmother." He paused, a flash of guilt crossing his face. I loved your grandmother, Emily. She was a wonderful woman, and we had a good life together. But Peggy, she was the road not taken, the great what if of my life." Emily nodded, understanding. "Life's complicated, Grandpa. Love even more so. I don't think Grandma would begrudge you this chance to reconnect with your past." Frank smiled gratefully at his granddaughter's wisdom. "When did you get so insightful?" he teased. "Must be all those Thompson genes." Emily shot back with a grin. As the evening wore on, Frank found himself opening up more about his past, sharing stories he had kept locked away for decades. He told Emily about the night he had decided to take the job in New York, effectively ending his relationship with Peggy. "I thought I was being responsible," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I had this idea that I needed to be successful to provide a stable future. I couldn't see that what Peggy and I had was worth more than any corporate success." Emily listened, her heart aching for the young man her grandfather had been forced to choose between love and what he thought was duty. "But you've had a change of heart now?" she prompted. Frank nodded slowly. "Life has a way of teaching you what really matters. All those years climbing the corporate ladder, and in the end, what do I have to show for it? A big house, a comfortable retirement, sure. But I'm alone, Emily, and I can't help wondering if I made the right choice all those years ago." As night fell, they finalized their plans. Frank would write another letter to Peggy, this time asking if he could visit her in Asheville. Emily insisted on accompanying him on the trip, a suggestion that filled Frank with both relief and nervousness. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" Frank asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him. "What if I'm just reopening old wounds?" Emily placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Grandpa, she wrote back to you after all these years. That has to mean something. And even if it doesn't work out the way you hope, at least you'll know." "No more what ifs." Frank nodded, drawing strength from his granddaughter's unwavering support. As Emily packed up her laptop and prepared to leave, Frank found himself filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The future, which had seemed so predictable just that morning, now stretched before him like an uncharted territory. "Emily," he called as she reached the door. "Thank you for everything." She turned back, her smile warm and reassuring. "Anytime, Grandpa. That's what family is for." As the door closed behind her, Frank returned to his study. He sat at his desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write. The words flowed easily now, fueled by hope and the possibility of redemption. "Dear Peggy," he wrote, "I can't tell you how much your letter meant to me. There's so much I want to say, so much I need to explain. If you're willing, I'd like to come to Asheville to see you." As he wrote, Frank felt as if he were reaching across the decades, trying to bridge the gap between the man he had been and the man he wished to become. With each word, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, replaced by a cautious optimism. When he finished, Frank sealed the letter in an envelope, his hand steady now as he wrote Peggy's address. Tomorrow, he would mail it, setting in motion a chain of events that could change everything. For the first time in years, Frank Thompson went to bed with a sense of anticipation, dreaming of mountain vistas and second chances. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect New England autumn day. Frank rose early, the letter to Peggy clutched in his hand like a talisman. As he walked to the local post office, the crisp air and vibrant fall colors seemed to mirror his internal sense of renewal. At the post office, Frank hesitated for just a moment before sliding the envelope into the outgoing mail slot. As it disappeared from view, he felt a mix of relief and nervousness wash over him. The die was cast. Now all he could do was wait. The days that followed were a strange mix of anticipation and fear. Frank found himself jumping every time the phone rang or when the mail arrived. Emily called daily, her steady presence a balm to his frayed nerves. A week passed, then two. Frank tried to keep himself busy, but his thoughts constantly drifted to Peggy and the life they might have had. He found himself pulling out old photo albums, lingering over faded pictures of a young couple full of dreams and promise. It was on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the call finally came. Frank's hands shook as he answered the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hello?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Frank?" The voice on the other end was older, a bit rougher, but still unmistakably Peggy's. "It's me. I got your letter." Frank sank into his armchair, overcome with emotion. "Peggy," he breathed. "It's so good to hear your voice." There was a pause, filled with decades of unspoken words and shared history. Then Peggy spoke again, her voice warm and tinged with a hint of nervousness that matched Frank's own. I think we have a lot to talk about, Frank. Why don't you come to Asheville? We can figure things out face to face." As Frank hung up the phone, he felt as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice. The future stretched out before him, full of possibility and the promise of redemption. With trembling fingers, he dialed Emily's number, ready to embark on the most important journey of his life. The hum of the airplane's engines provided a soothing backdrop as Frank gazed out the window, watching the landscape below transform from the familiar New England coastline to the rolling hills of the Appalachians. Beside him, Emily was engrossed in a book, occasionally glancing up to check on her grandfather. Frank's hands rested on the armrests, his fingers drumming in a regular rhythm that betrayed his nervousness. The closer they got to Asheville, the more real this journey became. He closed his eyes, memories washing over him like waves. He remembered the day he told Peggy about the job offer in New York. The look of disappointment in her eyes, quickly masked by a forced smile. "That's great, Frank," she had said, her voice tight. "It's a wonderful opportunity." But he had seen the light dim in her eyes, had felt the growing distance between them, even as she stood right in front of him. "Grandpa?" Emily's voice pulled him back to the present. "We're starting our descent. How are you feeling?" Frank opened his eyes, offering his granddaughter a wan smile. "Nervous," he admitted. "Excited. Terrified. I'm not sure there's a word for what I'm feeling right now." Emily patted his hand reassuringly. "It's okay to be nervous. This is a big step. But remember, you're not alone in this. I'm here for you every step of the way." As the plane touched down at Asheville Regional Airport, Frank felt his heart rate quicken. This was it. After decades of what-ifs and might-have-beens, he was about to face his past head-on. They collected their luggage and made their way to the rental car counter. As Emily handled the paperwork, Frank found himself drawn to the large windows overlooking the mountains. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks shrouded in a light mist. It was just as beautiful as he remembered from that long-ago vacation with Peggy. "Ready to go, Grandpa?" Emily appeared at his side, rental car keys in hand. Frank nodded, taking a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." The drive to their hotel was a blur of winding roads and breathtaking vistas. Frank barely noticed the scenery, his mind racing with thoughts of the upcoming meeting. They had agreed to meet Peggy the next day at a local cafe, giving Frank a night to settle in and prepare himself. As they checked into their hotel, a quaint bed and breakfast nestled in the heart of downtown Asheville, Frank felt a sense of unreality wash over him. Was he really here, about to meet the woman he had left behind so many years ago? That evening, as they sat on the balcony of their room, the twinkling lights of Asheville spread out below them, Emily turned to her grandfather. "Tell me what you're thinking, Grandpa. What do you hope will happen tomorrow?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "I'm not sure," he finally said. "Part of me hopes. Well, hopes for a miracle, I suppose. That we'll see each other and all those years will just melt away." He shook his head, a rueful smile on his face. "But I know that's not realistic. We're different people now. We've lived entire lives apart." Emily nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I guess what I really hope for is understanding," Frank said softly. "A chance to explain, to apologize. And maybe a chance to get to know the woman Peggy has become, to see if there's still a connection there." After all this time, Emily reached out, squeezing her grandfather's hand. "That sounds like a good place to start," she said. "Just remember, whatever happens, you're brave for doing this, for taking a chance on love, even at this stage of your life." Frank smiled at his granddaughter, feeling a surge of gratitude for her unwavering support. "When did you get so wise?" he teased. "Must be those Thompson jeans," Emily shot back with a grin, echoing their earlier conversation. As night fell, Frank found sleep elusive. He tossed and turned, his mind replaying memories of Peggy, imagining countless scenarios for their upcoming meeting. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were a kaleidoscope of past and present, youth and age, regret and hope. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the autumn air crisp and invigorating. Frank stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. He had chosen a suit that Emily assured him looked sharp, but not overly formal. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was dressing for the most important job interview of his life. "You look great, Grandpa," Emily said, appearing in the doorway, very distinguished. Frank attempted a smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "I feel like I'm going to be sick," he admitted. Emily crossed the room, straightening his tie with a gentle touch. "That's normal," she assured him. "But remember, Peggy agreed to this meeting. She wants to see you too. Just be yourself. That's all anyone can ask." They arrived at the cafe early, choosing a table on the outdoor patio with a view of the mountains. Frank's leg bounced nervously under the table as he sipped his coffee, his eyes constantly darting to the entrance. And then, suddenly, she was there. Peggy Sullivan walked into the cafe, her eyes scanning the patio. Frank felt his breath catch in his throat. She was older, of course, her hair now a striking silver instead of the chestnut brown he remembered. But her eyes were the same, that clear, intelligent gaze that had always seen right through him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then Peggy smiled, a small tentative curve of her lips, and made her way to their table. Frank stood, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. "Peggy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. It's good to see you." "Hello, Frank," Peggy replied, her voice warm but guarded. She turned to Emily with a friendly smile. "And you must be Emily. Frank told me about you in his letter." Emily stood, shaking Peggy's hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Sullivan. I've heard so much about you." As they all sat down, an awkward silence fell over the table. Frank found himself at a loss for words, all his carefully prepared speeches evaporating in the face of Peggy's actual presence. It was Peggy who finally broke the silence. "So, Frank," she said, her tone gentle but direct, "why don't you tell me why you're here? Why now, after all these years?" Frank took a deep breath, gathering his courage. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the chance to finally explain, to seek understanding, and perhaps, if he was very lucky, forgiveness. "Peggy," he began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I'm here because I owe you an explanation and an apology. I'm here because leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life, and I've spent the last 50 years regretting it." As Frank began to speak, pouring out decades of regret and longing, Emily quietly excused herself, giving the former lovers the privacy they needed. She walked to a nearby park, her heart full of hope for her grandfather and the woman who had held his heart for so long. Back at the cafe, Frank and Peggy talked for hours, their coffee growing cold as they bridged the gap of years between them. They spoke of the lives they had lived, the paths they had taken, and the dreams they had held on to. There were moments of laughter, of tears, of shared grief for the time they had lost. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the patio, Peggy reached out and took Frank's hand. "I can't say I'm not still hurt," she said softly, "but I'm glad you're here, Frank. I'm glad we have this chance to see where we stand." Frank felt a surge of hope at her words. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a chance. And for now, that was enough. As they stood to leave, making plans to meet again the next day, Frank felt as if a weight he had carried for decades was finally beginning to lift. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was also full of possibility. As Frank and Emily walked back to their hotel, the streets of Asheville were alive with the warm glow of sunset. The air was filled with the sound of street musicians and the enticing aromas from nearby restaurants. But Frank barely noticed any of it, his mind still reeling from the afternoon's conversation with Peggy. "So, how did it go?" Emily asked, her voice gentle but eager. She had been waiting patiently for her grandfather to share, not wanting to push him before he was ready. Frank was quiet for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "It was intense," he finally said, "emotional. We talked about so much, our past, the lives we've lived, the choices we made." He paused, a small smile playing on his lips. She's still Peggy, you know? Still that same sharp mind, that quick wit. But there's a wisdom there now, a depth that comes with age and experience. Emily nodded encouragingly, sensing there was more her grandfather wanted to say. We didn't resolve everything, Frank continued. How could we? 50 years is a long time, but we're gonna meet again tomorrow. She wants to show me around Asheville, the life she's built here. As they reached the hotel, Emily gave her grandfather a quick hug. That sounds like a good sign, Grandpa. I'm proud of you for taking this step. Back in their room, Frank found himself restless. The events of the day kept replaying in his mind. The moment he first saw Peggy, the way her eyes had lit up when she laughed at one of his old jokes, the feel of her hand in his as they said goodbye. He stepped out onto the balcony, breathing in the cool mountain air. The city lights twinkled below, and in the distance, the silhouette of the mountains loomed large against the night sky. It was a view he had once dreamed of sharing with Peggy. Now, decades later, he was finally here, but everything was different. The next morning, Frank woke early, a mixture of excitement and nervousness churning in his stomach. He and Peggy had agreed to meet for breakfast at a local diner before spending the day together. As he entered the diner, the bell above the door announcing his arrival, Frank spotted Peggy at a booth near the back. She waved him over, a warm smile on her face. "Good morning, Frank," she said as he slid into the seat across from her. "I hope you slept well as can be expected," Frank replied with a chuckle. "I think I was too excited about today to get much rest." Peggy's eyes softened at his words. "I know the feeling," she admitted. "It's strange, isn't it? After all these years, to be sitting here together." As they ordered breakfast, blueberry pancakes for Peggy, eggs and bacon for Frank, the conversation flowed more easily than it had the day before. The initial awkwardness had faded, replaced by a tentative warmth and the rediscovery of old rhythms. "So," Peggy said as they finished their meal, "I thought we could start with a walk through the botanical gardens. It's beautiful this time of year. Then maybe we could explore downtown, and I could show you some of my favorite spots." Frank nodded, eager to see the city through Peggy's eyes. As they left the diner and began their walk, he found himself marveling at how natural it felt to be by her side again. The botanical gardens were a riot of autumnal colors, brilliant reds, warm oranges, and deep golds. As they strolled along the winding paths, Peggy pointed out her favorite plants, her knowledge impressive and her enthusiasm infectious. "I volunteer here sometimes," she explained. "After I retired from teaching, I needed something to keep me busy. It's peaceful here, and I love watching the gardens change with the seasons." Frank listened intently, drinking in every detail about the life Peggy had built for herself. He found himself imagining what it might have been like if he had been a part of it all along, if he had been there to see her eyes light up at each new bloom, to share in her passion for this place. As they walked, their hands brushed against each other, sending a jolt of electricity through Frank. Without thinking, he reached out and took Peggy's hand in his. She looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face, but she didn't pull away. They continued their tour of Asheville, hand in hand, as Peggy showed Frank her favorite bookstore, the art gallery where she sometimes exhibited her watercolors, and the cozy cafe where she met with her book club. With each new revelation, Frank felt a mix of joy at getting to know this version of Peggy and a deep ache for all the years they had missed. As the afternoon wore on, they found themselves in Pack Square Park, sitting on a bench and watching the world go by. A comfortable silence had fallen between them, but Frank could sense that Peggy had something on her mind. "Frank," she finally said, her voice soft but steady, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Frank turned to face her, his heart racing. "Of course, Peggy. Anything." Peggy took a deep breath. "If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you have made the same choice? Would you still have taken that job in New York?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of what-ifs and might-have-beens. Frank felt the weight of it, the importance of his answer. "No," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "No, I wouldn't have. Taking that job, leaving you behind, it was the biggest mistake of my life. Peggy, I've regretted it every day since." Peggy nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I thought that might be your answer," she said, "but I needed to hear it. You see, Frank, I spent years wondering if I wasn't enough for you back then. If your ambition was more important than what we had." Frank felt his heart break at her words. He reached out, taking both of her hands in his. "Peggy, no. You were more than enough. You were everything. I was just too young and too foolish to see it." A single tear slipped down Peggy's cheek, and Frank gently wiped it away with his thumb. "I can't change the past," he said softly, "but I'm here now if you'll have me. I know we can't just pick up where we left off. Too much has happened. We've both changed too much for that. But I'd like the chance to get to know you again, to be a part of your life in whatever way you'll allow." Peggy was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching Frank's face. Then, slowly, a smile began to spread across her features. "I'd like that, Frank," she said. "I'd like that very much." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Frank and Peggy walked back towards the hotel, their hands intertwined. They had agreed to take things slow, to give themselves time to rediscover each other and see where this new chapter might lead. When they reached the hotel, Frank turned to Peggy. "Thank you for today," he said, "for showing me your Asheville, for giving me this chance." Peggy smiled, reaching up to cup Frank's cheek in her hand. "Thank you for coming back," she said softly. Then, standing on her tiptoes, she placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. As Frank watched Peggy walk away, her figure silhouetted against the setting sun, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in decades, it was filled with hope and possibility. Back in his hotel room, Frank found Emily waiting eagerly for news. As he recounted the events of the day, his face glowing with happiness, Emily felt her own eyes fill with tears of joy. "I'm so happy for you, Grandpa," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. "This is the beginning of something beautiful. I can feel it." As night fell over Asheville, Frank stood on the balcony once more, his heart full. The mountains loomed in the distance, no longer a reminder of what he had lost, but a promise of new adventures to come. With Peggy by his side, he was ready to explore not just this city, but this new chapter of his life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and conversations, but for now, Frank was content to bask in the glow of possibility, grateful for second chances and the enduring power of love. As the days in Asheville unfolded, Frank found himself falling into a comfortable rhythm with Peggy. Each morning brought a new adventure, a chance to explore not just the city, but the people they had become over the years. On their third day together, Peggy suggested a hike in the nearby Pisgah National Forest. As they made their way along the trail, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet, Frank marveled at Peggy's vitality. She moved with a grace and energy that belied her years, pointing out various plants and birds with enthusiasm. "I never pegged you for the outdoorsy type," Frank commented as they paused to catch their breath at a scenic overlook. Peggy laughed, the sound echoing through the trees. "I wasn't back then," she admitted, "but after I moved here, I fell in love with these mountains. They have a way of calling to you, of making you want to explore." As they stood there, gazing out over the vast expanse of forest spread out before them, Frank felt a surge of emotion. He turned to Peggy, taking in the way the dappled sunlight played across her face, the wind gently tousling her silver hair. "I wish I had been here to discover it with you," he said softly. Peggy's eyes met his, a mix of emotions swirling in their depths. "So do I, Frank," she replied. "But we're here now. Maybe that's what matters most." As they continued their hike, the conversation turned to their lives over the past 50 years. Frank spoke of his career, his marriage, the joy of becoming a father and grandfather. Peggy shared stories of her years as a teacher, the students whose lives she had touched, the community she had built in Asheville. "Did you ever marry?" Frank asked, the question he had been hesitant to voice finally slipping out. Peggy shook her head. "No, I never did. There were relationships over the years, some serious, but..." She trailed off, her gaze distant. "I guess a part of me was always waiting. For what? I'm not sure. Maybe for this." Frank felt his heart swell at her words. He reached out, taking her hand in his as they navigated a particularly rocky part of the trail. The gesture felt natural, as if their hands had never forgotten the shape of each other. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, they made their way back to Peggy's car. The drive back to Asheville was quiet, both of them lost in thought, processing the day's conversations and the emotions they had stirred up. That evening, as they sat in a cozy restaurant in downtown Asheville, the soft glow of candlelight illuminating their table, Frank felt a shift in the air between them. The tentative warmth of the past few days had deepened into something more profound. "Peggy," he said, his voice low and serious, "I need you to know something. These past few days with you, they've been some of the happiest of my life. And I know we said we'd take things slow, see where this leads, but I think I'm falling in love with you all over again." Peggy's eyes widened at his words, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her wine glass. "Oh, Frank," she breathed. I think I am too, but it scares me. We're not the same people we were 50 years ago. What if we're just chasing a memory?" Frank reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We're not," he said firmly. "You're right. We've changed. But getting to know you now, the woman you've become, I'm in awe of you, Peggy. Your strength, your kindness, your passion for life. I'm not in love with a memory. I'm in love with you, here and now." Tears glistened in Peggy's eyes as she squeezed Frank's hand. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "But Frank, what happens when you go back to Connecticut? We've built entire lives apart. How do we bridge that gap?" It was a question Frank had been grappling with himself. The practical concerns of their situation, the distance, their established lives, their families, loomed large. But looking into Peggy's eyes, he knew he couldn't walk away again. "I don't have all the answers," he said honestly, "but I know I want to figure it out together. Maybe I could split my time between here and Connecticut. Or maybe I could move here if you'd have me. I know it's a big step, but Peggy, I don't want to lose you again." Peggy's breath caught at his words. "You'd do that? Leave your home, your life in Connecticut?" Frank nodded, his decision solidifying as he spoke. "My life is wherever you are, Peggy. Emily's grown, with a life of her own. There's nothing tying me to Connecticut except habit and memories. But here, with you, this feels like a new beginning." Peggy was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching Frank's face. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her features. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's do it. Let's give this a real chance." As they left the restaurant, walking hand in hand through the streets of Asheville, Frank felt a sense of exhilaration he hadn't experienced in years. The city lights twinkled around them, and the cool night air was filled with the sound of laughter and music from nearby bars and cafes. They paused on a bridge overlooking the French Broad River, the water glittering in the moonlight. Frank turned to Peggy, drinking in the sight of her, the way the moonlight silvered her hair, the soft curve of her smile, the warmth in her eyes as she looked at him. Without a word, he pulled her close, one hand cupping her cheek as he leaned in to kiss her. It was a gentle kiss, soft and sweet, filled with the promise of new beginnings and the weight of their shared history. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Peggy rested her forehead against Frank's. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "Even when I thought I should, even when I tried to move on, a part of my heart was always yours." Frank felt tears prick in his eyes. "And mine yours," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Always and forever, Peggy." As they walked back to Peggy's house, plans and possibilities swirled in Frank's mind. There would be challenges ahead, telling their families, figuring out the logistics of Frank's move, merging their lives after so many years apart. But for the first time in decades, Frank felt truly alive, truly hopeful about the future. Back at the hotel, Frank found Emily still awake, waiting up for him. One look at his face told her all she needed to know. "It's really happening, isn't it?" she asked, a mix of happiness and wistfulness in her voice. Frank nodded, pulling his granddaughter into a hug. "It is," he confirmed. "I'm going to move here, Emily, to be with Peggy. I know it's a big change, but..." Emily cut him off with a squeeze. "It's wonderful, Grandpa. You deserve this happiness. And don't worry about me. Asheville's a great place to visit. I expect regular invitations. As Frank lay in bed that night, sleep eluding him, his mind raced with thoughts of the future. He imagined mornings with Peggy, exploring the mountains together, building a new life in this beautiful city. There was so much to do, so much to plan, but underlying it all was a sense of rightness, of coming home. 50 years ago, he had made a choice that altered the course of both their lives. Now, given a second chance, he was choosing love, choosing Peggy, and this time, he knew with absolute certainty it was the right choice. Shall I continue with the sixth block of 1,500 words? Copy Richard Zetas. The week in Asheville drew to a close. Frank found himself facing the bittersweet reality of returning to Connecticut. Though he and Peggy had made plans for his eventual move, there were still loose ends to tie up, arrangements to be made. The prospect of leaving, even temporarily, filled him with a mixture of anticipation and dread. On their last full day together, Peggy suggested they visit the Biltmore estate, Asheville's crown jewel. As they wandered through the opulent rooms and manicured gardens, Frank couldn't help but draw parallels to their own story. You know, he mused as they strolled through the rose garden. This place was built on a grand vision of the future, but it also honors the past. Kind of like us, don't you think? Peggy squeezed his hand, a soft smile playing on her lips. I like that analogy, she said. We're building something new, but we're not forgetting where we came from. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, they found a quiet spot on the estate grounds, overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. Frank pulled Peggy close, savoring the warmth of her body against his. I don't want to leave tomorrow, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Peggy turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. I don't want you to go either, she said. But Frank, this isn't goodbye, it's just. See you soon? Frank nodded, forcing a smile. I know, and I'll be back before you know it. We have a lot to plan after all. They spent the evening at Peggy's house, sharing a home-cooked meal and talking late into the night. As they sat on her porch swing, a blanket draped over their laps to ward off the autumn chill, Frank felt a sense of peace settle over him. Tell me about your house in Connecticut, Peggy said, her head resting on his shoulder. I want to picture where you'll be when we're apart. Frank described his colonial-style home, the garden he had tended for years, the study where he spent most of his time. As he spoke, he realized how much of it he was ready to leave behind. It's a beautiful home, he concluded, but it's never felt quite right since Sarah passed. Too big, too empty. Being here with you in this cozy house, it feels more like home than anywhere has in years. Peggy lifted her head, meeting his gaze. It will be your home soon, she said softly. Our home. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, as if the weather was echoing Frank's mood. As he and Emily prepared to leave for the airport, Peggy arrived to see them off. The goodbyes were emotional, filled with promises to call and visit soon. When it was time to go, Frank pulled Peggy into a tight embrace. I love you, he murmured into her hair. I'll be back before you know it. Peggy's eyes were bright with unshed tears as she pulled back to look at him. I love you too, she replied. Safe travels, my dear. As the taxi pulled away, Frank watched Peggy's figure grow smaller in the rearview mirror. Emily reached over, squeezing his hand. It's not goodbye, Grandpa, she reminded him gently. It's just the beginning. The flight back to Connecticut felt interminable. Frank's mind was already racing with all he needed to do. Speak to his lawyer, put his house on the market, start packing up a lifetime of memories. But underlying the practical concerns was a sense of excitement, of anticipation for the life that awaited him in Asheville. Over the next few weeks, Frank threw himself into preparations for his move. He and Peggy spoke daily, sometimes for hours, planning and dreaming about their future together. They decided that Frank would move to Asheville permanently after the new year, giving him time to settle his affairs in Connecticut and spend the holidays with his family. As news of his impending move spread, Frank was touched by the outpouring of support from his friends and neighbors. There were farewell dinners, offers of help with packing, and promises to visit him in his new home. Emily was particularly supportive, helping her grandfather sort through decades of accumulated possessions and memories. As they worked together in his study one afternoon, carefully wrapping old photo albums and mementos. Emily paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, Grandpa," she said, "I've been thinking about what you're doing, taking this leap, starting a new chapter at this stage of your life. It's really inspiring." Frank looked up from the box he was packing, touched by his granddaughter's words. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot to me," Emily continued, her voice soft but earnest. "It's made me think about my own life, about not taking love for granted. I've been so focused on my career, I've barely given myself time for relationships. But seeing you and Peggy, how you found each other again after all these years, it's a reminder that it's never too late for love." Frank crossed the room, pulling Emily into a tight hug. "Oh, my dear," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have so much life ahead of you. And when the right person comes along, you'll know. Just promise me you won't let fear or ambition stand in the way of love. Take it from someone who knows. Love is always worth the risk." As the weeks passed and the move grew closer, Frank found himself reflecting on the twists and turns his life had taken. He thought of Sarah, his late wife, and the life they had built together. There was a bittersweet quality to these memories now, tinged with both gratitude for the years they had shared and a wistful wondering about what might have been with Peggy. One crisp December afternoon, Frank visited Sarah's grave, laying a bouquet of her favorite flowers at the headstone. "I hope you understand, my dear," he said softly, his words carried away by the cold winter wind. "I loved you, truly I did. But Peggy, she's the road not taken, the dream I never quite let go of. I think you would want me to be happy." As he turned to leave, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He would always cherish the memories of his life with Sarah, but now he was ready to fully embrace his future with Peggy. The holidays were a whirlwind of family gatherings and last-minute preparations. Frank's children and grandchildren rallied around him, helping with the final stages of packing and offering words of encouragement. There were tears and laughter, bittersweet goodbyes, mixed with excited anticipation for what lay ahead. On New Year's Eve, Frank stood in his empty house, surrounded by boxes and the echoes of a life well lived. In just a few days, he would be on a plane to Asheville, to Peggy, to his new beginning. As the clock struck midnight, ushering in a new year, Frank raised a glass in a solitary toast. "To second chances," he murmured, his heart full of hope and love. The day of the move dawned bright and clear, the January sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered lawn. As Frank locked the door of his Connecticut home for the last time, he felt a mixture of nostalgia and excitement coursing through him. Emily and his son Michael were there to drive him to the airport. The car ride was filled with last-minute advice and reminders, interspersed with comfortable silences. As they pulled up to the departures terminal, Frank felt a lump form in his throat. "Wow," he said, his voice slightly shaky. "I guess this is it." Michael helped him with his bags while Emily linked her arm through his as they walked into the airport. At the security checkpoint, Frank turned to his family, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "Thank you both," he said, pulling them into a group hug, "for understanding, for supporting me in this. I love you both so much." "We love you too, Dad," Michael said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Be happy, okay?" Emily wiped away a tear, her smile bright despite her watery eyes. "Give Peggy our love. And remember, we expect frequent visits and video calls." As Frank made his way through security and towards his gate, he felt a sense of lightness, of possibility. He was leaving behind a lifetime of memories, but he was moving towards a future filled with love and new adventures. Settling into his seat on the plane, Frank pulled out his phone, smiling at the text message that had just come through. "Safe travels, my love. I can't wait to welcome you home. Peggy." As the plane took off, soaring above the familiar landscape of Connecticut, Frank closed his eyes, his heart full of gratitude for this unexpected journey, this second chance at love. Asheville, Peggy, and a whole new chapter of life awaited him. As the plane touched down in Asheville, Frank felt his heart rate quicken. Through the small oval window, he could see the Blue Ridge Mountains rising in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. This was it. This was home now. The familiar butterflies in his stomach as he deplaned reminded him of that first trip to Asheville months ago. But this time, instead of uncertainty, he felt a surge of excitement and anticipation. As he made his way through the terminal, his eyes scanned the crowd, searching for one face in particular. And then he saw her. Peggy stood near the baggage claim, her silver hair catching the light, her eyes bright with anticipation. When their gazes met, her face broke into a radiant smile that took Frank's breath away. He quickened his pace, weaving through the crowd until he stood before her. For a moment, they just looked at each other, drinking in the sight. Then, without a word, Peggy stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "Welcome home," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Frank held her close, breathing in her familiar scent, feeling the warmth of her body against his. "It's good to be home," he replied softly. As they drove from the airport to Peggy's, now their house, Frank felt a sense of surrealism wash over him. The streets of Asheville, which had seemed so unfamiliar just months ago, now felt welcoming. He recognized landmarks, remembered stories Peggy had told him about various places they passed. "How does it feel?" Peggy asked as they pulled into the driveway. "To be here for good?" Frank turned to her, a smile playing on his lips. "It feels right," he said simply, "like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as Frank settled into his new life. There were boxes to unpack, a new routine to establish, and a whole city to rediscover through the eyes of a permanent resident rather than a visitor. Peggy had cleared space in her closet and drawers for Frank's things, and seeing their clothes hanging side by side filled him with a quiet joy. It was a tangible reminder of their new shared life. They fell into a comfortable rhythm together, their days filled with small domestic pleasures. Mornings began with shared cups of coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains. They took turns cooking dinner, playfully critiquing each other's efforts. In the evenings, they often sat in companionable silence, Frank reading while Peggy worked on her latest watercolor. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of friction as they adjusted to living together after so many years of independence. Frank's habit of leaving his shoes in the middle of the floor drove Peggy to distraction. Peggy's tendency to stay up late painting sometimes disrupted Frank's sleep schedule. Yet even in these moments of tension, there was an underlying current of joy and gratitude. Each small disagreement was an opportunity to learn more about each other, to grow together. One evening, about a month after Frank's move, they decided to host a small dinner party. Peggy invited a few of her closest friends, eager to introduce them to Frank properly. As they prepared for the evening, Frank found himself growing nervous. "What if they don't like me?" he asked Peggy as he adjusted his tie for the third time. Peggy came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her chin on his shoulder. Their eyes met in the mirror. "They'll love you," she assured him, "because I love you, and they'll see how happy you make me." The dinner was a success. Frank charmed Peggy's friends with stories of his life in Connecticut and his whirlwind romance with Peggy. As the evening wore on, he found himself relaxing, feeling a sense of belonging among these people who had been part of Peggy's life for so long. Later that night, as they cleaned up together, Peggy turned to Frank, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Frank asked, puzzled. "For being here, for taking this leap with me, for coming back to me after all these years." Frank set down the dish he was drying and pulled Peggy into his arms. "Thank you for waiting," he murmured, "for giving me a second chance." As winter melted into spring, Frank and Peggy's life together blossomed like the flowers in their garden. They threw themselves into exploring Asheville together, discovering new favorite spots and revisiting old ones. They joined a local book club, signed up for ballroom dancing lessons, and volunteered at the botanical gardens. Frank's children and grandchildren came to visit, filling the house with laughter and creating new memories. Seeing his family blend so seamlessly with his new life filled Frank with a profound sense of contentment. One warm evening in late spring, Frank and Peggy decided to take a walk in the nearby park. As they strolled hand in hand, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Frank felt a surge of emotion. He stopped, turning to face Peggy. "I want to ask you something," he said, his voice serious. Peggy looked up at him, curiosity and a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "What is it, Frank?" Frank took both of her hands in his heart pounding. "Peggy Sullivan," he began, 50 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life by letting you go. I've been given a second chance, and I don't intend to waste it." He dropped to one knee, ignoring the twinge in his joints. From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box. "Will you marry me?" Peggy's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. For a moment, she was speechless. Then, tears glistening in her eyes, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Frank Thompson, I will marry you." As Frank slipped the ring onto her finger, a delicate band with a small diamond, elegant and understated, just like Peggy, he felt as if his heart might burst with happiness. They shared a kiss, sweet and tender, full of promise for the future. As they walked home, both a little giddy with joy, they began to plan their wedding. "Nothing too big," Peggy said. "Just our closest friends and family." Frank nodded in agreement. "What matters is that we're together," he said. "Everything else is just details." Over the next few months, their life took on a new excitement as they prepared for their wedding. They decided on a small ceremony in the botanical gardens, surrounded by the flowers and plants that Peggy loved so much. As the big day approached, Frank found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought of the young man he had been, so focused on his career that he had let the love of his life slip away. He thought of the years that followed, the successes and failures, the joys and sorrows. And he thought of that fateful day when he had decided to write to Peggy, setting in motion the events that had led him here. The night before the wedding, as they sat on their porch swing, watching the fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Frank turned to Peggy. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what our lives would have been like if I had stayed? If we had gotten married all those years ago?" Peggy was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I think about all the experiences we've had, the people we've become, and I realize that maybe this was how it was always meant to be. Maybe we needed those years apart to truly appreciate what we have now." Frank nodded, pulling her close. "You're right," he said softly. "Everything we've been through has led us here, to this moment, and I wouldn't change a thing." As they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, the future stretching out before them, filled with promise, Frank felt a profound sense of peace. Tomorrow, he would marry the love of his life, beginning a new chapter in a story that had spanned half a century. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself all those years ago. It was something better, something richer, and more beautiful than he could have ever dreamed. It was a second chance, a new beginning, a love story 50 years in the making. And as the stars began to twinkle in the velvet sky above, Frank Thompson knew with absolute certainty that the best was yet to come. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the sky a perfect azure blue. Frank woke early, his heart filled with a mixture of excitement and a calm certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Peggy. They had decided to spend the night before the wedding together, eschewing the tradition of separate accommodations. "We've spent enough nights apart," Peggy had said with a smile when they discussed it. Frank made his way to the kitchen, starting the coffee maker and stepping out onto the porch. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from their garden. As he watched the sun rise over the mountains, casting a golden glow across the landscape, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Back inside, he found Peggy in the kitchen, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "Good morning, almost husband," she said, her eyes twinkling with joy. "Good morning, almost wife," Frank replied, pulling her into a gentle embrace. They stood there for a moment, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment before the whirlwind of the day began. As they sipped their coffee, there was a knock at the door. Emily burst in, her arms full of garment bags and boxes. "Rise and shine, lovebirds," she called out cheerfully. "It's wedding day." What followed was a flurry of activity as they prepared for the ceremony. Friends and family members arrived, the house filling with laughter and excited chatter. Frank found himself ushered into the guest room to dress, assisted by his son Michael and grandson Tyler. As he buttoned his crisp white shirt and adjusted his tie, Frank caught sight of himself in the mirror. The face that looked back at him was lined with age, hair silver instead of the dark brown of his youth. But his eyes were bright, filled with a joy and vitality that made him look years younger. "You ready for this, Dad?" Michael asked, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder. Frank nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "More than ready," he replied. "I've been waiting for this day for 50 years. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Peggy was getting ready with the help of Emily and her own daughter, Lisa. As Emily carefully pinned Peggy's hair, weaving small white flowers into the elegant updo, Lisa helped her mother into her dress. The dress was simple but elegant, a soft ivory sheath that fell to her ankles with delicate lace sleeves. As Peggy looked at herself in the full-length mirror, she felt a rush of emotions. "Oh, Mom," Lisa breathed, her eyes filling with tears. "You look beautiful," Peggy smiled, reaching out to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Thank you, sweetheart, for everything, for supporting this, for being here today." Lisa hugged her mother gently, careful not to wrinkle the dress. "I'm just happy to see you so happy, Mom. Frank, he's good for you. Anyone can see that." As the morning progressed, guests began to arrive at the botanical gardens. The ceremony was to be held in a secluded corner of the rose garden, where a simple arch had been erected and decorated with climbing roses and delicate white flowers. Frank arrived first, escorted by Michael. As he stood under the arch, waiting for Peggy, he felt a sense of déjà vu. He had stood in a similar position over 50 years ago, waiting for a different bride. But this time, instead of the nervous anticipation of youth, he felt a deep, abiding certainty. This was right. This was where he was meant to be. The small gathering of friends and family quieted as the soft strains of music began to play. And then, there she was. Peggy appeared at the end of the aisle, escorted by her grandson. Frank felt his breath catch in his throat at the sight of her. She was radiant, her face glowing with happiness, her eyes locked on his as she made her way towards him. As Peggy reached him, Frank took her hands in his, overwhelmed by the love he saw reflected in her eyes. The officiant, a kindly older woman who was a friend of Peggy's, began the ceremony. "We are gathered here today," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the garden, "to witness the union of Frank and Peggy. Theirs is a love story 50 years in the making, a testament to the enduring power of true love and the beauty of second chances." As the ceremony progressed, Frank and Peggy exchanged vows they had written themselves. Frank went first, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Peggy," he began, "50 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life by letting you go. I've spent the intervening years building a life, raising a family, pursuing a career, but there was always something missing, a piece of my heart that I'd left behind with you. Standing here today, I promise to spend the rest of our days making up for lost time. I promise to love you, support you, and cherish you, today and every day. You are my past, my present, and my future, and I am eternally grateful for this second chance of love with you." Peggy's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she began her own vows. "Frank, my dear Frank, our journey has been long and winding, with many detours along the way, but it led us here, to this moment, and for that, I am thankful. I promise to love you with the wisdom of our years and the passion of our youth. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your lover, and your biggest supporter. We may have lost 50 years, but we have the rest of our lives ahead of us, and I can't wait to spend every moment of it with you." There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering as they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that gleamed in the sunlight. And when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the joy that radiated from Frank and Peggy was palpable. Their kiss was sweet and tender, a promise of the life they would share together. As they turned to face their friends and family, now officially introduced as Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, the applause and cheers that erupted seemed to echo the joy in their hearts. The reception that followed was a joyous affair, held in a nearby pavilion in the gardens. Tables were adorned with centerpieces of wildflowers, and fairy lights twinkled overhead. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses as toast after toast was made to the happy couple. As the evening wore on, Frank and Peggy shared their first dance as husband and wife. The band played a slow, romantic song, the same one they had danced to on their first date all those years ago. As they swayed together, lost in each other's eyes, the years seemed to fall away. They were no longer two people in their 70s, but two young lovers with their whole lives ahead of them. "Are you happy?" Frank murmured, his lips close to Peggy's ear. Peggy leaned back slightly, meeting his gaze with a radiant smile. "Happier than I've ever been," she replied. "Are you?" Frank nodded, pulling her close again. "Incredibly so. I feel like my life is just beginning." As the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Frank and Peggy found a quiet moment alone. They stood at the edge of the gardens, looking out over the twinkling lights of Asheville spread out below them. "Well, Mrs. Thompson," Frank said, wrapping an arm around Peggy's waist, "what do you say we go home?" Peggy leaned into him, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "Home," she repeated. "I like the sound of that." They bid farewell to their remaining guests and made their way to the car that would take them back to their house, their home. As they drove through the quiet streets of Asheville, both were lost in thought, reflecting on the day and the journey that had brought them to this point. Arriving home, Frank surprised Peggy by scooping her up into his arms to carry her over the threshold. She laughed in delight, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Careful, darling," she cautioned. "Don't throw your back out on our wedding night." Frank chuckled, setting her down gently in the foyer. "Worth the risk," he said, pulling her in for a kiss. As they got ready for bed, the events of the day catching up with them, Frank found himself marveling at how natural it all felt. This wasn't just the start of their marriage. It felt like the continuation of a lifelong partnership, as if the intervening years had never happened. Lying in bed, Peggy curled up against Frank's side, her head resting on his chest. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Frank was quiet for a moment, his fingers gently stroking her arm. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," he finally said. "About how, out of all the possible paths my life could have taken, it led me here, to you. And I'm thinking about all the adventures we have ahead of us." Peggy lifted her head, meeting his gaze in the dim light of their bedroom. "I love you, Frank Thompson," she said simply. "And I love you, Peggy Thompson," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. As they drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, Frank felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over him. Tomorrow would be the first day of their new life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and the joy of every moment shared. It was a new beginning, a second chance at happily ever after, and Frank couldn't wait to see what the future held. As the weeks following their wedding turned into months, Frank and Peggy settled into a rhythm of married life that felt both familiar and excitingly new. Each day brought small joys and discoveries as they continued to build their life together. One sunny Saturday morning, as they sat on their porch enjoying their ritual morning coffee, Peggy turned to Frank with a twinkle in her eye. "I've been thinking," she began, a hint of excitement in her voice. Frank raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, about what, my dear?" "Well," Peggy continued, setting down her coffee mug, "we never did have a proper honeymoon. What do you say we take a trip? See some of those places we always talked about visiting when we were young." Frank's face lit up at the suggestion. "That sounds wonderful," he agreed enthusiastically. "Where did you have in mind?" Over the next hour, they pored over maps and travel websites, their excitement growing with each destination they considered. They finally settled on a European adventure, starting in Paris, then making their way through the Italian countryside before ending their trip in Greece. As they made their plans, Frank couldn't help but marvel at how different this was from his first marriage. With Sarah, travel had always been an afterthought, something to do when there was time between work commitments. But with Peggy, it felt like they were embarking on a grand adventure together, ready to explore the world with the wisdom of their years and the excitement of new lovers. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity as they prepared for their trip. They applied for passports, shopped for comfortable walking shoes, and brushed up on their high school French and Italian. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and soon their friends and family were offering suggestions and must-see recommendations. Finally, the day of departure arrived. As they boarded the plane that would take them across the Atlantic, Frank felt a surge of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. He reached for Peggy's hand as they settled into their seats, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Ready for our adventure, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked with a grin. Peggy's eyes sparkled as she replied, "More than ready, Mr. Thompson. Let's make some memories." Their first stop was Paris, the city of light. They spent their days wandering the charming streets, marveling at the architecture and indulging in decadent French cuisine. In the evenings, they would sit at sidewalk cafes, sipping wine and watching the world go by, often talking late into the night about their hopes for the future and reflections on the past. One evening, as they stood atop the Eiffel Tower, the city spread out below them in a glittering tapestry of lights. Peggy turned to Frank with tears in her eyes. "Do you remember?" she said softly, "how we used to talk about coming here someday, back when we were young and dreaming of the future?" Frank nodded, pulling her close. "I remember," he said. "I'm sorry it took us so long to get here." Peggy shook her head, a soft smile on her lips. "Don't be sorry. We're here now, and that's what matters. And you know what? I think I appreciate it more now than I would have back then. We've lived, Frank. We've experienced life in all its complexity. That makes this moment all the sweeter." Frank felt his heart swell with love for this remarkable woman. He leaned in, kissing her tenderly as the lights of Paris twinkled around them. From Paris, they made their way to Italy, spending lazy days exploring the sun-drenched hills of Tuscany. They stayed in a charming villa overlooking rolling vineyards, waking each morning to the sound of church bells in the distance. One day, they decided to try their hand at a cooking class, learning to make pasta from scratch under the tutelage of a boisterous Italian chef. The kitchen was soon filled with laughter as they fumbled with the dough, flour dusting their clothes and faces. As Frank watched Peggy, her face flushed with laughter and concentration as she carefully shaped her ravioli, he felt a rush of affection so strong it almost took his breath away. This was the life he had always dreamed of, full of joy, adventure, and love. That evening, as they sat on the terrace of their villa, enjoying the pasta they had made, imperfect but delicious, along with a bottle of local wine, Frank raised his glass in a toast. "To us," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "To second chances and new adventures." Peggy clinked her glass against his, her eyes shining. "To us," she echoed. "And to making every moment count." Their final destination was the Greek islands. They spent their days exploring ancient ruins, swimming in the crystal-clear waters of the Aegean, and eating far too much delicious Greek food. On their last night, they found themselves on a secluded beach, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Frank turned to Peggy, taking both her hands in his. "Peggy," he said, his voice soft but intense, "these past few months, this trip, our wedding, every day I get to wake up next to you, it's been like a dream. A beautiful dream I never want to wake up from." Peggy squeezed his hands, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Oh, Frank," she whispered, "it's not a dream, it's real. We're real, and we have so much more life to live together." As they held each other close, the gentle lapping of the waves providing a soothing backdrop, Frank felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over him. This was what he had been searching for all his life, this sense of completeness, of belonging. Returning home to Asheville after their whirlwind adventure, Frank and Peggy found themselves falling back into their daily routines with a renewed sense of appreciation for their life together. Their home, which had always been comfortable, now felt even more so, filled with new memories and mementos from their travels. One evening, as they sorted through the hundreds of photos they had taken on their trip, Peggy paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know," she said, looking up at Frank, "I've been thinking, we're not getting any younger, and we have all these wonderful experiences. Maybe we should write them down, not just for us, but for our children and grandchildren, a record of our love story." Frank's face lit up at the suggestion. "That's a wonderful idea," he agreed enthusiastically. "We could make it a project, write about our past, our present, our hopes for the future." And so began their next adventure. Each evening, they would sit together, sometimes at the kitchen table, sometimes curled up on the porch swing, and write. They recounted their youthful romance, the years apart, their reuniting, and their new life together. As they wrote, they found themselves having deep conversations about their lives, sharing thoughts and feelings they had never expressed before. It was a process of discovery, not just of each other, but of themselves. One night, as they were writing about their wedding day, Frank paused, his pen hovering over the paper. "You know," he said softly, "I keep thinking about how different this all is from my first marriage. Not better or worse, just different." Peggy reached out, placing her hand over his. "Tell me," she encouraged gently. Frank was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. With Sarah, everything was comfortable, safe. We had a good life together, and I loved her dearly. But with you, it's like every day is an adventure. Even just sitting here, writing, it feels exciting, like we're explorers charting unknown territory." Peggy nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I know what you mean," she said. I think it's because we know how precious this is. We know what it's like to lose each other, so we cherish every moment we have now." As summer turned to fall, their book began to take shape. It was a love story, yes, but it was also a story of life, of dreams and disappointments, of choices and consequences, of the wisdom that comes with age and the joy that comes from never stopping to learn and grow. They decided to title it The Long Way Home, a love story 50 years in the making. When they finally finished the last page, they sat back, a sense of accomplishment washing over them. "We did it," Peggy said, a note of wonder in her voice. "We actually wrote a book." Frank pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We did," he agreed. "And what a story it is." They had copies printed for their children and grandchildren, presenting them as Christmas gifts that year. The response was overwhelming. Tears, hugs, and heartfelt thanks for sharing their story. Emily, in particular, was moved by the book. "Grandpa," she said, her voice choked with emotion as she hugged Frank tightly, "It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing this with us, for showing us what true love looks like." As Frank held his granddaughter, he felt a sense of completion. Their story was out there now, a testament to the power of love and the beauty of second chances. And yet, he knew it wasn't the end. It was just another chapter in their ongoing adventure. That night, as Frank and Peggy lay in bed, hands intertwined, Peggy turned to him with a smile. "So," she said, a hint of mischief in her voice, "what's our next adventure going to be?" Frank chuckled, pulling her close. "I don't know," he admitted, "but as long as I'm with you, I'm ready for anything." As they drifted off to sleep, Frank's last thought was one of gratitude for Peggy, for their love, for this beautiful life they were building together. Whatever the future held, he knew they would face it side by side, hand in hand, heart to heart. As the years passed, Frank and Peggy's love continued to deepen and evolve. They faced the challenges of aging together with grace and humor, supporting each other through health scares, celebrating milestones, and cherishing every moment they had together. Their 70s gave way to their 80s, and while their bodies might have slowed down, their spirits remained as vibrant as ever. They became fixtures in their Asheville community, known for their warmth, wisdom, and the obvious love they shared. On the morning of their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank woke early. He carefully extracted himself from Peggy's embrace, trying not to wake her. He made his way to the kitchen, his movements a bit slower now, but still purposeful. With painstaking care, he prepared a tray with Peggy's favorite breakfast: blueberry pancakes, crispy bacon, and a steaming mug of coffee. He added a small vase with a single red rose from their garden and the gift he had been working on in secret for months. As he carried the tray back to their bedroom, he paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of Peggy still asleep, her silver hair spread out on the pillow. Even after all these years, the sight of her took his breath away. "Peggy, my love," he called softly. "Wake up. Happy anniversary." Peggy stirred, her eyes fluttering open. As she saw Frank standing there with the tray, a radiant smile spread across her face. "Oh, Frank," she said, sitting up. "You shouldn't have." Frank set the tray down carefully on the bed, leaning in to kiss her good morning. "Nonsense," he said. 10 years of married bliss deserves a celebration." As they enjoyed their breakfast together, Frank couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. 10 years of marriage. but a lifetime of love. They had packed so much living into these years: travels, adventures, quiet moments at home, the joy of watching their family grow with the addition of great-grandchildren. "I have something for you," Frank said when they had finished eating. He handed Peggy a carefully wrapped package. Peggy opened it with trembling fingers, gasping softly as she revealed a handcrafted photo album. As she flipped through the pages, tears welled up in her eyes. Frank had painstakingly collected photos from throughout their lives, their youth, the years apart, and their life together now. Each page was annotated with his own handwritten memories and reflections. "Oh, Frank," Peggy whispered, her voice choked with emotion. It's perfect." "Thank you." Frank wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I wanted to give you something that captured our whole story," he said softly. "The good and the bad, the years apart and the years together, because all of it, every moment, led us here." They spent the morning looking through the album together, laughing and crying as they relived memories both old and new. It was a testament to their love story, not just the romance, but the friendship, the partnership, the deep understanding they shared. As the day wore on, they received a steady stream of calls and visits from friends and family, all eager to congratulate them on their anniversary. Their small house was filled with flowers, cards, and the warm wishes of those who loved them. That evening, they decided to recreate their first date in Asheville. They went to the same restaurant where they had dined that night, marveling at how little it had changed, even as they had grown older. As they sat across from each other, hands intertwined on the table, Frank felt a surge of emotion. "You know," he said, his voice soft but intense, "marrying you was the best decision I ever made. These past 10 years have been the happiest of my life." Peggy squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. "Mine too, my love. I never imagined, when I got your letter all those years ago, that we'd end up here, but I wouldn't change a thing." As they left the restaurant, the warm summer night enveloping them, Frank surprised Peggy by pulling her into a gentle dance right there on the sidewalk. A street musician nearby was playing a soft melody on his guitar, providing the perfect soundtrack. "Frank Thompson," Peggy laughed, even as she moved easily into his arms. "What has gotten into you?" Frank smiled, spinning her carefully. "Just feeling young at heart," he replied, "and madly in love with my beautiful wife." As they swayed together under the stars, oblivious to the smiles of passers-by, Frank was struck by how right this felt. How, even after all these years, Peggy still made his heart skip a beat. The days that followed their anniversary were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. They had always lived life to the fullest, but now there was an added urgency to make every moment count. They threw themselves into new projects and adventures. Peggy started teaching art classes at the local senior center, sharing her passion for watercolors with others. Frank volunteered at a literacy program, helping adults learn to read. Together, they started a storytelling circle at their local library, sharing their experiences and encouraging others to do the same. It quickly became a popular event, with people of all ages gathering to listen and share. One evening, as they sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset over the mountains, Peggy turned to Frank with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what we'll leave behind when we're gone." Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. It was a subject that had been on his mind as well, as they entered their twilight years. "I think," Peggy continued, "that our greatest legacy is love. The love we've shared, the love we've spread to others. Our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, they'll carry that love." Frank felt his eyes mist over at her words. "You're right," he said softly. "And you know what? I think we've done a pretty good job at that." As the years continued to pass, Frank and Peggy faced the inevitable challenges of aging. There were health scares, days when their bodies didn't cooperate as well as they used to, moments of forgetfulness that frustrated them both. But through it all, their love remained constant. They faced each challenge together, supporting each other with unwavering devotion. Their children and grandchildren rallied around them, providing help and support when needed, but always respecting their independence. On their 15th wedding anniversary, now well into their 90s, they decided to renew their vows. It was a small, intimate ceremony in their backyard, surrounded by the flowers Peggy had lovingly tended for years. As they stood facing each other, hands clasped tightly, the years seemed to fall away. They weren't two people in their 90s, but two souls who had found each other again and again across a lifetime. "Peggy," Frank said, his voice wavering slightly but filled with emotion. 15 years ago, I stood before you and promised to love you for the rest of my days. I renew that vow today with even more love and gratitude than I had then. You are the best part of my life, my partner in everything. I love you more with each passing day." Peggy's eyes shimmered with tears as she responded, "Frank, my darling, my heart, loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. I vow to continue loving you, supporting you, and cherishing every moment we have together. You are my home, my heart, my everything." As their family and friends wiped away tears, Frank and Peggy sealed their renewed vows with a kiss. It was a moment of pure love, a testament to the enduring power of their bond. In the years that followed, as their physical abilities diminished, Frank and Peggy found new ways to express their love and share their joy. They became master storytellers, regaling their great-grandchildren with tales of their youth, their time apart, and their reunion. They continued to write, filling journals with their thoughts, memories, and words of wisdom for future generations. These journals would become treasured family heirlooms, passed down through the years as a testament to their love story. Even as their world gradually shrank to the confines of their home, their love continued to grow and expand. Every shared meal, every held hand, every whispered "I love you" was a celebration of their enduring bond. In their final years, as they became more dependent on care from their family and health aides, their love shone as brightly as ever. They faced the end of their journey as they had faced everything in life, together, with grace, dignity, and an unshakable devotion to each other. On a peaceful spring morning, in their 100th year, Frank and Peggy passed away within hours of each other. They had spent their final days as they had spent the last decades of their lives, side by side, hands intertwined, surrounded by the love of their family. As news of their passing spread, tributes poured in from all who had known them. Friends, family, and community members all spoke of the profound impact Frank and Peggy had had on their lives. They were remembered not just for their remarkable love story, but for the kindness, wisdom, and joy they had spread throughout their lives. At their joint memorial service, Emily, now a grandmother herself, stood to speak. Her voice filled with emotion, she addressed the gathered mourners. "My grandparents, Frank and Peggy, taught us all what true love looks like. Their story wasn't just about romance. It was about friendship, partnership, and the choice to love each other every single day. They showed us that it's never too late for a second chance, that love can overcome any obstacle if you're willing to fight for it. But more than that, they taught us how to live. They approached each day with curiosity, gratitude, and a zest for life that was truly inspiring. They loved deeply, laughed often, and always made time for what truly mattered. As we say goodbye to them today, let us carry forward their legacy. Let us love fiercely, live fully, and always believe in the power of second chances. For in doing so, we keep their spirit alive in our hearts. As the service concluded, a soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of blooming flowers. It felt to those gathered like a final loving embrace from Frank and Peggy, a reminder that true love never really ends, but lives on in the hearts of all those it touches. And so, the story of Frank and Peggy, a love that spanned a lifetime, overcame decades of separation, and blossomed anew in their twilight years, came to a close. But in many ways, it was just the beginning. For their love story would continue to inspire generations to come, a testament to the enduring power of love, the beauty of second chances, and the profound joy that comes from sharing your life with your soulmate. In the end, Frank and Peggy's greatest legacy was not the years they lived, but the love they shared, a love that transcended time, overcame obstacles, and showed the world that it's never too late for happily ever after. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!